Confucius said that just as there can't be two suns in the sky, there can't be two emperors on the earth. And the word they use for emperor most of the time is Ba, and the tone they use means hegemon. After 4,000 years of being the global hegemon in their mind, now is it their rightful place to regain that. In 2013, they published the Made in China 2025. I was shocked. Going back to Sun Tzu, they never tell you what they're going to do unless they've made the decision that you either don't have the wherewithal or the will to stop them. It just showed the audacity and the the misunderstanding they had of where America was at that point. From a political point of view, what I'm trying to do right now is make sure that we have the flexibility, in America anyway, to deal with a rising China. The first book that was written back in the 90s, I think, was The Rise of China. There was a guy that had been in the news media and had been in Beijing for, I think, a decade or whatever, and wrote that book. And I think personally, this is my personal opinion, that we sort of all got it wrong. You know, when Deng Xiaoping in the 80s said to get rich is glorious, we thought that, okay, this economic model would mature over time, it would change. Now, there were some that were in the West that were naive to think, well, as they become affluent, they'll become more like us. Well, that was arrogant and naive. And a lot of us didn't understand the long-term cultural history of the Han Chinese. And so today we have a new body of work being developed, and that's people who had one position back in the 80s and 90s and 70s, and now have a beginning to have a different opinion. People like Michael Pillsbury, even Henry Kissinger had a speech the other day. He's got a new book out on China, is the title. Hank Paulson has a new book. And even Newt Gingrich has weighed in on the subject here in the last couple of months. So this is a topic that we're trying to wrestle with. And I think there are two basic options here. And I'm going to try to be very brief. I'd like to leave some time for a dialogue here. There are basically two options. If you listen to what they say, China they quote Confucius and they quote Sun Tzu all the time. I'm talking about the leadership now. 7% of the population of China are members of the Communist Party. And many of their leadership actually believe some of the propaganda that they put out today. But what they say, they quote Confucius a lot. And Confucius has one saying that I think is very telling about their transition right now. And that is that Confucius said that just as there can't be two suns in the sky, there can't be two emperors on the earth. And the word they use for emperor most of the time is Ba, and the tone they use means hegemon. So the question is after 4,000 years of being the global hegemon in their mind, now is it their rightful place to regain that? And there are some of us who believe that's actually where they're headed. And they talk about 2049 as a year that by 2049, Xi Jinping says we want a military second to none. Well, in the last 2.5 years, last 30 months, they've actually put more ships in the water than they did in the prior 30 years. Let me say that again. In the last 30 months, China has they've commissioned more hardware on the ocean, more ships and submarines than they had done in the prior 30 years. And they're not done yet. There's a pipeline being built there. And as Bonnie was talking earlier, and we can talk about this later, that builds up certain things. I mean, when you build an infrastructure as fast as China has done, and I've seen it firsthand, and many of you have as well, there's a maintenance, there's a sustainment issue and a sustainment cost that comes along with that. They're going to have that problem in the military. We have it right now ourselves. We have 292 ships in our military Navy, and we're struggling, frankly, with the base of maintenance facilities that we have to make that, to keep up with the required maintenance of that. So we have two options in China. One, I think we can enter into another Cold War, and we could slip into that very easily. In fact, I'm not sure we're not in the early days of that right now. A Cold War with an arms race. And if we sit here and think that we're going to win the next arms race the way we won the last one, by not firing a bullet and by outspending our adversary, I personally, as a financial guy, I just don't see that happening if it's mano a mano. With 1.4 million people, a billion people, and we've got 300 and something, that's not the answer. And the answer is, even if that were the case, what we've got to do is basically build our #1 asset, and that's our allies around the world. The way I see the world today is this, and this is a very elementary perspective. I apologize, but sometimes the simple solution might be the best. But the way I look at the world, there are state-controlled countries, and there are self-determination countries. Now, there are different forms of self-determination. There are social democracies like France. There's representative democracies like ours. But in self-determination, it's pretty clear. It's a monolithic model, and that is a few people get power, and they dictate to the rest of the people what life is going to be about. And I can back that up with several things that are going on in China today. But what we have is a situation where when you look at those two types of countries in the world, the economic, I'm talking about an arms race now, just from that perspective alone, this is what we're seeing. You've got the state-controlled, I would argue, is less than $20 trillion of economic power. Now, you can adjust for purchasing power parity, and I'll let you bump it up a little bit. But if you take the self-determination states in the world, you get over $65 to $70 trillion of economic power. Now, as China continues to grow, that formula will change a little bit, but it certainly highlights in the next 30 years, the 30 years that I think are going to be so important to dictate what the world looks like over the next century, is that we need to make sure that that equation is right. Now, today it's not right. Why is it not right? NATO, since World War II, has not, and I'm going to say it the way Americans say it, they haven't paid their fair share for their own defense. And I can back that up from the standpoint that they spend about 1% of their total aggregate GDP on military investment. We spend about 3% today. Now, that's down about 25% from where it was 10 years ago, and that's a problem. But on the other hand, if they had been, and that delta, if they were just spending the 3% of their GDP that we've been spending, they would have been spending $400 billion more a year in their defense. Now, that would probably mean that we would not have to spend $760 billion like we're going to have to spend next year. And by the way, and I'm rambling here a little bit, I want to get back to the second option. This is the wake-up call that we have in the United States, and the Chinese have not missed this, and that is that every dime we spend on our military, every dime that we spend on our military is borrowed money today because of our financial situation here in the United States. Now, China's got a problem with debt too. It's just harder to manage it, harder to measure that. So one option is we could slip into an arms race, a Cold War, and the world cannot afford for us to do that. We cannot afford for us to do that, in my opinion. Does that mean we disengage? No, it means we engage further. And that's what I'm trying to do as a member of the Senate. Steve Daines, who also lived over there, I lived in Singapore and Hong Kong. We did some of the first joint ventures in China. We are trying to develop a more in-depth relationship with other people besides just Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. We've had their Judiciary Committee from their NPC has come to our operation here. We've been over there and taken delegations over there. So we're trying to develop a more in-depth relationship. But what we have to do is realize that if we don't engage, then this will become a reality. But by engaging, then, we look at the second option, and here's the question of the day, in my opinion. And I have an opinion. It's a weak backup, but you know, the question is can we coexist as two economic powers and compete and cooperate? And that's the question. I don't mind them having a strong military. We have a strong military. But if we cooperate from the standpoint of economic development of the world, think about this. There are 80 million people, refugees, today, roaming the face of the earth. 80 million. We're generating the next generation of terrorists around the world today. We're doing that. The West is. And so by not addressing that issue collectively, it's going to overwhelm us. I mean, I've been to Gaziantep. I've seen some of these refugee camps. I've been to Jordan. I've seen them trying to immerse. Been to Turkey, seen how they're trying to immerse this into their population. It's not working. I've been to Egypt. They got 6 million refugees in Egypt. They don't have the infrastructure. So China, being the big economic power that it is and will be, and the United States being the big economic power that it is and will be, we owe it to the world to get together and do what the United States pretty much has done single-handedly over the last 70 years, and that's helped the rest of the world develop economically. Some measures say that because of our U.S. Navy and because of the economic power that we've had in the United States and our open market here, that we've helped lower serious global poverty by some over 50% in the last 30 years. And I've seen that in some places. So those are the two options before us. I think to understand where China is today, and I'm going to try to abridge this just a bit, you have to look at what they're doing and what they're saying. George Patton got it right. You know, when he told Rommel, he said, "I read your book, you bastard." Well, you got to do that here. You got to listen to them and take them for what they say. Well, I think it was 2013, they published the Made in China 2025. I was shocked, and I wasn't in politics at that point. I mean, I was just a guy out in the hinterland with some background over there, and I looked at this and I read it and I thought, wow, they're telling the world that they want to dominate by 2025 within a decade basically, 2025, the 12 areas of technology. And how were they going to do that? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But it just showed the audacity and I think the misunderstanding they had of where America was at that point. They saw America as withdrawing from the international scene, which we were doing and have been doing for 3 or 4 years. And they felt bullish about that. In my view, in the Chinese culture, going back to Sun Tzu, they never tell you what they're going to do unless they've made the decision that you either don't have the wherewithal or the will to stop them. And that's where Made in China 2025, that was a realization that hit me like a ton of bricks all of a sudden, and I think that's right. I think they've made that determination. And when you look at the investments they've made behind that and the activities that they have had behind that, it leads to this conversation we've had today. We've put it all under trade negotiation where Trump says, hey, it's $500 billion of trade deficit, we got to fix that. But it's much broader than that. We're negotiating with them right now, and I was over there on Labor Day and met with Vice Premier Liu He, and we do these trips very regularly. And the thing about going to Beijing is they will give you an audience. They really will meet with you. They really will engage. Now, you'll hear the propaganda, but they really will engage. But Liu He, most of these guys are Western educated. Their kids are Western educated. Most of them speak English, as you know very well. And so this is a very efficient conversation. But that conversation led to then 3 weeks later a partial deal, a beginning of a step-by-step process to actually deal with the trade question. So I think that's a huge breakthrough, and I'm very encouraged by that. But we've got to do a lot more of that. What they've also done in this trade conversation, though, we're trying to do 5 things. We're trying to, and this goes back to Made in China 2025, because to get there by 2025, they had to do a lot of nefarious things. And we need that to stop, frankly. And the world needs it to stop, some of it to stop. We want them to stop stealing our technology outright. That happens. We want them to stop forcing the transfer of technology in these joint ventures. That happens. We want them to comply with the WTO. We help them get in to the WTO. We want them to stop the cyber war, and we want equal access. Well, the easiest thing to get in there is equal access, and that's why I thought all along that getting this great mammoth deal put together and wrap it up with a ribbon was never realistic. And so what we've done now is try to come back and say, and the White House is now agreeing, that let's do this in a step-by-step manner, and I think that is hugely encouraging if we can stay with that. The Belt Road Initiative. Look, who can fault them for trying to develop parts of the world that are important to them? Trade, they want to secure their supply chains for precious metals and food and energy. I get that, no problem. But when it becomes proprietary and you see what's happening with I think it's around 36 ports in Africa and 52 ports in South America. I see what they're doing in Central America, particularly in Panama and then in Venezuela. I get really concerned because what they're doing is making these proprietary loans. They've already foreclosed in Colombo and Karachi. They have this 99-year lease in Cambodia now. They're 30 clicks down the coast in Djibouti from us. We see the expansion of their interest. If it's just trade, no problem. But I have a hard time saying when you're going into a place like Colombo and you foreclose on your weak partner and then you turn that port into a military port, it raises questions in my mind about what the original intent was. Then I come to the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. The Shanghai Cooperative Organization has many members in it. And it's a military agreement or a military basis or a platform for conversation. Well, there are 4 nuclear members of that: Russia, China, Pakistan, and India, among others. And so you look at that and what they're trying to do there, what they were trying to do in trade when we backed up from the TPP debate. But now that we've got a free trade agreement with South Korea and Japan, and if we get a USMCA done very quickly, this has a huge impact on the relationship that we're trying to develop with China. And the last thing I'll talk about here is what they're doing. You have to pay attention to the social credit score, what they're doing. I spent a day last year with Jack Ma at Alibaba and understood a little bit about data and how data is shared there and how privacy is totally looked at culturally differently there than it is here. And that's an ongoing thing that I'm trying to learn about. It's a mammoth difference, and it's hugely important as to how we try to deal with them. We have to take our lens off when we deal with China. Bonnie and I were talking about this just before coming out here. It's like when I came to Washington, I see things so differently than people who have been here for 30 years. That's just natural. It doesn't make me smarter. I have a different lens. And so I see the debt in a totally different way than somebody who's been here for 30 years. So when I look at China, I have a different lens than somebody who is looking at it from a Washington perspective. And I look at this social credit score, and I understand why Xi Jinping, who is president for life, this is important. And the thing that echoes this more than anything else is what's happening in Hong Kong right now. So the social credit score really concerns me because there's a group of people in the Communist Party are going to dictate what are the correct actions of personal behavior, and we're going to grade the population against that. And if you want to buy a car, you want to travel, you want to buy an apartment or whatever, or certainly get a job or join the party, you have to have toed the line, and we're going to measure that. Well, combine that with facial recognition and 196 million cameras in 8 cities, you kind of see where the headlines are going to be in the next 20 or 30 years, or not. And you look at what's happening in Xinjiang right now with the Uyghurs and that sort of thing, you kind of get an idea that they're concerned about controlling this population. They're more monolithic than we are, but they are diverse too. Just the numbers are just different. I think diversity is one of our strengths, obviously. They think that the monolithic culture is certainly one of theirs. It has been for 5,000 years. But we'll see about that. Last thing is military. I mentioned the 30 months investment in the Navy versus the last 30 years. That creates an issue for us because we have 292. They've said that we want 355 ships in the Navy. I would argue with that, frankly, because if you look at the way the military allocates our budget today, we spend $760 billion. We have 14% overhead. Now, as a business guy, that's the first thing I look for is where's the wasted money that's not getting to the tip of the spear? Well, that's 14%. That's a big number. And so that's $100 billion. You look at what's causing that. Well, in the 60s, that overhead was 2%. Now it's 14% on our military. That's just a maturing military. We have overhang. We have the VA. We have social costs like retirement costs and healthcare costs and all that. The Chinese don't quite have that yet. They will. But the other thing you have to look at is when you get past the overhead, the allocation of the rest of the money in our military is a third, a third, a third. Now, that's not consistent. That's Navy, Army, and Air Force. That's not consistent with the NDS. The NDS says that we've got to stand up to China's growing naval power. And so when you look at 292 to 355, that comes from an earlier conversation that we get locked into that is not reflective of the NDS. So as a member of the Armed Services Committee, that's an area we're trying to debate right now and trying to bring back in. I'll close with this. This is too important to get wrong today. I believe we got it wrong back in the 80s and 90s. We were naive. We looked at this with the American lens, and we were arrogant. We were the 800-pound gorilla. The wall in Berlin had just come down. The world was going to turn into a democratic state overnight. It just hasn't happened. It won't happen in my lifetime. But what we can have is this. We can grow self-determination in whatever form that feels like. That's what Hong Kong's about, I believe. Taiwan to some degree. When you look at other parts of the world, though, they're still wrestling with that. We have Africa sitting there. This needs China and the U.S. to become a cooperative force in the world today. And if we don't, and line our allies up with that, it could turn into a very dark world.
How do you evaluate the impact of Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act, probably positive or negative impact on trade issues in the short or long run? Thank you.
You know, I think it's the question of our time both here and how we engage with China. I've just said the two things we need to do is engage. Well, if you engage, how can we influence China with their monolithic structure, with the Communist Party, where 7% make the rules, and now they have this social credit score development that they're trying to, you know, Xi Jinping is demonstrating that he is very concerned about keeping control of the population inside China as it develops. You can only look that the allocation of capital has been very inefficient in China. Now, yes, they have developed very rapidly, but you can throw a lot of capital at infrastructure and build 23,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, which they've done. But what happens is when you have this sort of movement into 400 million people who are now consumers, middle-class consumers, I think the leadership over there right now is really struggling with how are they going to maintain control, and will there be a challenge to the communist ethos? That's what I mean, that's a non-political observation of somebody that has friends inside China and really cares a lot about this relationship between the two countries. Hong Kong is going to have a traumatic influence on that, potentially. This suffrage idea about whether we're going to have open and honest votes for the leader, I think will be the real litmus test for Xi Jinping. I don't see it, personally, I don't see him being able to do that right now. And that's going to have a big impact. This won't go away easily, but it's already having a big impact inside China. Social media is alive. These people in China now understand what's going on in Hong Kong. Many don't understand why. because frankly they've never seen it or lived it. But there's a lot of cross-border information flowing about that, and it will long-term have a dramatic impact on how the leadership in China, I believe, deals with the number one problem they have, and that's controlling their own population.